Now, what's going on is that the Chinese are testing food supplies specifically, and that's how you know that they're getting ready to lay some blame, because there's no country in the world that thinks you can import COVID on, say, frozen meat, except for the Chinese. There can be infections on the packaging, that's certainly true, but we know after 2 years of COVID that the only way that you might then be able to get COVID is if you shred the materials and then snort them. You can't get COVID from a surface. But this is what they're preparing for. And anytime you do mass testing like they're doing in Tianjin now, you are going to find cases of Omicron, because it is the most infectious disease we have ever dealt with. Now, if Tianjin goes into lockdown, as seems increasingly likely, that will mean that Tianjin and Beijing are in lockdown in the north, Shanghai in the center, and Guangzhou in the south. And that also means that the three biggest transport and manufacturing hubs in the country, again, Tianjin, Guangzhou, and Shanghai, would all be in lockdown of some degree all at the same time. So we are looking at the majority of Chinese manufacturing, for all intents and purposes, being inaccessible to the wider world or even to the internal Chinese system. Now, I've been telling my clients for quite some time that it was only a matter of issue as to how the American-Chinese relationship imploded. Could be Trump, could be Biden, could be energy, could be food, could be security, could be trade, could be ethics, could be genocide. You know, it's a long list. But it appears that COVID ultimately is the one that is winning out. The Chinese vaccine does not work against COVID, and the Chinese have spent the last 2 years lambasting the world and lying in the propaganda that they are the only country that has even remotely dealt well with COVID, and they've specifically parroted a lot of the crazy theories out there about the Western vaccines, that they make you magnetic or they make you infertile or whatever else. So they can't import the Western vaccines at all. They have to wait till they make their own mRNA formula, and there's no way that's going to happen in the next year or two. So lockdowns are the only public health policy they have, and now the majority of the parts of China that matter are offline. If you're stuck in manufacturing in China, this is the beginning of the end, if it's not the end already. Because as soon as you have an opening, Omicron comes back in, and then you get a closing again, because that is the only tool that the Chinese Communist Party has left. So, the question is, what's next? There is a limited option for relocating manufacturing supply chains from China to other parts of the world, most notably North America. We are experiencing a labor shortage in the United States that will not be let up for at least 20 years. We just know that the Zoomer generation is a relatively small one. They've all been born already. They're feeding into the labor market now. And we know exactly how big our shortage of labor is going to be until the 2040s. Mexico also is capable of helping, but only to a limited degree, because they had a baby bust back in 1995, and their birth rate has been declining ever since. That's long enough ago that is starting to affect their labor markets. So, first mover advantage means a lot, and companies that have decided to ignore the writing on the wall for the last 4 or 5 years and just assumed that everything was going to go back to how it was before Donald Trump are now being violently disabused of those notions, and they are the late people to the party, and they're the last ones in line for getting labor to relocate things from China. Tianjin is the single largest port in northern China being where roughly 2/3 of the Chinese live. It is a import-export port that focuses on the importing of bulk commodities such as foodstuffs, oil, ores, that sort of thing. Northern China is a little bit different from southern China. The southern China city-states, in effect, are all export entrepôts and hubs, whereas in northern China, because more people live there, a lot of the manufacturing is for domestic consumption, so they have to bring in raw materials from elsewhere. That doesn't make Tianjin more or less important than other places, say Shanghai or Guangzhou. It just makes it a different kind of important.
The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, There will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And there's plenty other competitors to put the bullet in China's head. Yeah, all the way from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in 45 years. Sure, well, there's two things. First of all, of course, is one child. Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a two-child policy, ultimately to a one-child policy, and that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second check. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development into 1. And that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once. And now it's behind them. And now they have no children. And they have very few people under age 45. Unchecked population growth is necessarily the way to go. That's not what I'm after here. I mean, you require a balance between children, young workers, and mature workers. If you don't have enough mature workers, you don't have the capital. If you don't have enough young workers, you don't have the consumption. If you don't have the children, you don't have a future. China is already out of those last 2 categories. And so we know where this lead to zero. Well, it depends upon how you apply the lessons to your system. In the case of Europe, I'd say they got it 3 times. But there's definitely an upper limit. One of the things to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about European demographics, is that in Europe, people are not living longer. Overall lifespan has not improved. What's improved is we've gotten rid of a lot of mortality. So the things that used to kill you when you were 0 to 65 don't kill you anymore. The 3 countries in the world, in the advanced world, actually in the advanced and in the developed world, New Zealand, France, United States, and largely for the same reason. They're countries that have a little bit more physical space, so their cities tend to be more of a sprawl. You're more likely to have a backyard. More people can live in the countryside and be economically viable. So when these 3 countries urbanized, they did it at a slower rate, and they remain the 3 advanced countries with the lowest urbanization rates in the world. In the advanced developing world, the closest one is going to be Mexico, and for similar reasons. Central Mexico, which is on a highland massif, is just one giant suburban sprawl. And that means that people can have more children. Now, all of these countries still have their own demographic hiccups. They all have the baby boomer problem. It's just that they all have replacement generations. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a very broad array of countries, it's very difficult to make a generalization. They've started to industrialize. And so they're going down the same path that everybody else did. And the first step of that path is lowering infant and child mortality. And so when 1 out of 3 children don't die, you have an explosion in your birth rate. But if you play that forward 10, 15 years, then you start having adjustments in family planning and you get smaller and smaller families as urbanization kicks in. The danger for countries that are in this category who've taken the first but not the second step is that they've imported a lot of the technologies of industrialization, which has helped them out, but they have not developed the systems to sustain that themselves. So if something happens to the outside environment, they lose all of the benefits.
What, like?
Healthcare, medicines, fertilizers. It's very easy for me to see a lot of these countries facing famine in the not too distant future. Because if you break down globalization, yes, that means it's difficult to get oil or manufactured goods. I'm more concerned about agriculture.